Alright, let's take a look at biodiversity. In these slides, we'll discuss conservation biology and island biogeography theory, and also conservation efforts. So first of all, this term conservation biology, I got a long definition for you here. It is the scientific discipline devoted to understanding the factors, forces, and processes that influence the loss, protection, and restoration of biological diversity within and among ecosystems. So that's kind of a mouthful, but bottom line is the main goal of conservation biologists is to prevent extinction. And this discipline arose in recent decades as biologists grew alarmed at the degradation of natural systems they had spent their lives studying. There's the biggest, or perhaps at least one of the biggest theories of conservation biology is known as the equilibrium theory of island biogeography. And this relates to our lab today with the habitat loss, or habitat fragmentation, habitat islands. So I want to show you this picture again, going back to it. This is an island of mangrove trees off the coast of Florida, part of the Florida Keys. And what they did back then is this theory, well, we'll get to that in just a minute, explains how species diversity patterns arise on islands as a result of immigration of species from the mainland to the island, extinction on the island, island size, and distance of the island from the mainland. And the theory originally developed as basic science for oceanic islands, and then it was found to apply to islands of habitat or fragments within terrestrial systems for conservation biology, like we saw in the lab today where we had the context of the U.S. forests. So let's take a look at a couple of graphs here. This first graph is showing that immigration rates are highest for islands with few species. Basically what we're saying is if an island doesn't have many species, that means there are available niches for new species to come in and fill. We also can say that extinction rates are highest for islands with many species. The more species you have on an island, the greater the chance that some of them will go extinct, as each of the population size of each of them is smaller. So this sets the stage for examining effects of island size and distance. And I want to show you here about the number of species on the island. So the number of species can be affected by the size and the distance. Okay, now we can also say that immigration rates are highest on large islands. They're like big targets for species leaving the mainland and trying to get to these islands. Like in the lab we did today, the bigger the targets, the easier it was for the bean to land on it. We can also say that extinction rates are highest on small islands because the size of the populations is smaller. And we don't have to get too into this graph, and I'm not going to give this graph to you and ask you to interpret it. If you want to really stare at this and figure out what's going on, we're finding that there's a balance point. When rates of immigration are the same as rates of extinction, then you get basically a steady size of number of species. And on a small island where they cross is over here on the left, which indicates fewer species. On the right, for large islands where you have less extinction but greater immigration, you have basically a larger number of species. So this graph is telling us the sort of like equilibrium, the steady number of species on the island, and depending on its size. Okay, next slide. Together this means large islands have a large number of species at equilibrium, the area effect. So these larger islands have more species. So we can also say immigration rates are highest for islands near the mainland. So basically it's a shorter distance to go for a member of that species to make it into this new habitat. And like we saw today with the beans, the closer the targets are, the greater the chance they're going to get there and land on it. And extinction rates are not affected, so we only see one extinction rate coming through here. But for far islands, we get smaller immigration, so this equilibrium point is more to the left, indicating fewer species on the island. And for nearer islands, the immigration rate is higher, and so these cross further to the right indicating more species. Again, I'm not going to ask you to interpret one of these graphs. The bottom line is, together this means islands near the mainland have a larger number of species at equilibrium. This is known as the distance effect. So we have actually collected data on this on Caribbean islands. That would have been a fun trip to be on for research. The larger the islands in the Caribbean, the more species, the greater species richness. And so here we have number of species on the vertical axis and area, and this is what we call logarithmic scale because every line is 10 times greater. And you can see here that Cuba is the largest island and it has the greatest number of species on it. And Redondo, the smallest, has the fewest. So the summary of this equilibrium theory of island biogeography is the larger the island, the more species, because less extinction, because larger populations. And the closer the island to the mainland, the more species, because more immigration, because it's closer. So this theory was actually first tested experimentally on small mangrove islands in the Florida Keys when they had all arthropods become extinguished from them with a pesticide. And then the researchers observed as species returned to the islands. Equilibrium numbers matched their predictions, supporting the theory. Nowadays, we do land studies which also show historical declines in mammals in national parks. So we're not going in and killing the mammals and seeing how many come back, but we are noticing that the number of mammals has been declining. And we do find that the smaller the park, the more species have declined. This has been measured. And this is consistent with the parks acting as land islands. So these little green circles would be like the targets that we're using in our lab today. So this is an idea of fragmentation, taking area of habitat and separating it so that species can't easily move from one area to another. The islands of interest to conservation biologists include forest fragments, like we talked about, and forest fragmentation occurs as continuous forest habitat gets broken up gradually. So we can see how this may have been the original habitat, and then you go in there and you do a little bit of lumber harvesting, and then even some more, and before you know it, you actually have islands. And this leads to local extirpations of forest species. Remember, extirpation means it becomes extinct only in that area, or removed only in that area. Extinct means not present on the planet anywhere. And as these fragments become too small to support them, this can happen. And also it can happen when the fragments become too distant to allow immigration. So you can also use wildlife corridors to help improve it and making bridges basically between these islands. And I have a little video clip that I showed you in EDU about that. Pretty awesome. So let's switch gears here and talk a little bit about conservation approaches. So with endangered species, we're trying to preserve single species threatened with extinction. This is the goal of the endangered species laws, although they often also achieve umbrella conservation. We'll talk about what these terms mean. Here's one law that you definitely have to know for apes, and it is the U.S. Endangered Species Act, ESA, of 1973. And this restricts actions that would destroy endangered species or their habitats, and it forbids trade in products from species. And it prevents extinction, stabilizes, and recovers populations. There have been some success stories of this. For example, the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon, both of those were on the endangered list, and 40% of all declining populations now are being held stable. However, many citizens believe it will restrict their freedom if endangered species are found on their land. And so this can be a little tricky, and this is one of the reasons that we do environmental impact reports before going in and developing land. So habitat conservation plans, safe harbor agreements, and Canada's Species at Risk Act also promote cooperation with landowners, but you don't need to know about those for now. We also do captive breeding. Many endangered species are being bred in zoos to boost populations and reintroduce them into the wild. And here we see, can you guess what they are? Those are condors. And this has worked so far for the California condor. And here you see a puppet, hand puppet, feeding chicks, so it imprints on the birds and not humans. But this is worthless if there is not adequate habitat left in the wild. We want these species to be existing wild and not just in captivity. So another idea here that falls under this conservation is umbrella species. When habitat is preserved to meet the needs of an umbrella species, it helps preserve habitat for many other species. Thus, primary species serve as an umbrella for others. And large species with large home ranges, like tigers and other top predators, are good umbrella species. The idea is that if you make efforts to protect them, then indirectly you're going to be protecting many other species who also live in that habitat. Some other terms are flagship species or charismatic species that win public affection, like the panda. And so that's another term. It's not flagship species like the panda are not umbrella species necessarily, but they're just basically like poster childs for saving endangered species because they're so cute. Okay, polar bears would be the same idea. International treaties, yet a different approach here. These are various treaties that have helped conserve biota, or living organisms. And one major one is CITES, and this is one other one that you need to know for sure. This stands for Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It was also written in 1973, and what it does specifically is it bans international trade and transport of body parts of endangered organisms. So this can help reduce, for example, the trade of elephant tusks. There are other international treaties. This one you do not need to know. It is the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, from the Rio Conference. Again, trying to conserve biodiversity and ensuring fair distribution of its benefits. Meaning that we all humans benefit from large biodiversity, and this should be done for all the countries that have these areas of high biodiversity. Okay, and so the CBD has been signed by 188 nations, but not by the US. So here's another idea, Biodiversity Hotspot. It's an area that supports an especially high number of species, more than 1,500, endemic to the area, meaning found nowhere else in the world, and experiencing severe habitat loss. So this is the endangered golden lion tamarin, which is endemic to Brazil's Atlantic rainforest, which has been almost totally destroyed. And here's a graph that I found just this morning online. This is from 2012. It came out of some research done at North Carolina State. And what they did was they used color to show areas on the planet where there's the greatest biodiversity of animals. And you can see in these rainforest areas, like in northern South America, in Brazil and also Peruvian rainforests, we get very high biodiversity. And so the one thing I want you to look for is some trends here. Where do you see the greatest amount of biodiversity looking at the globe as a whole? Hopefully you can recognize that it's along the equator, the areas that are more tropical, for reasons that we don't entirely understand. Where you have greater temperatures and greater rainfall, you get greater biodiversity. And part of the thought is that this is where plants have been growing for longer periods of time through Earth's history. And so you're going to have greater opportunities for speciation of different number of species of plants and animals to evolve. Okay, that's the wrap. I'll see you guys in class.